start with the presentation. We've got here in Edinburgh around about 8 people attending, and we've got a few people online as well, so welcome. And I'm just going to introduce my colleague Geeta, who's going to come up and do a presentation. If you've got any questions, you should be able to have options to just jot a little question down, and we hope to go through those at the end of the talk. So those that are online, please join in. Okay, we'll go to full screen. Okay, Geeta, would you like to come up?
I'm just too scared to touch this. Just
use the mouse. Yeah, and then just talk as normal.
And then to change slide, you just click on the next.
Just the same as PowerPoint. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I had to travel so far to get here today, but thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not a geologist. Never have been. I'm just saying that now, so I'm saying it up front. I just thought it is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek presentation as a soil scientist who skated around geology a little bit in the past. I just hope you find it interesting, really. It's just some observations from really working in the Scottish Government for many years and looking at where data sits and who takes responsibility for which bits of the environment. So this is very much a personal view, not the views of Atmos. I'm just doing the disclaimer stuff now as well. Anyway, that's me, soil scientist. And I thought organic soils are a good example of where there's a little bit of ambiguity sometimes of where it's soils, where it's geology, whatever you want to call it. Okay. Yay. I'm sorry that's not very clear. Lucy will tell you I'm not really good at cutting and pasting maps, but I wanted to start off with a couple of things side to side here. Firstly, it's the one I'm familiar with. If we look at a soils map of Scotland, courtesy of the Macaulay Institute, now known as the James Hutton Institute, Soil Survey of Scotland, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's the 1 to 250k soils map. It's quite interesting to have alongside that from the BGS website what's called superficial geology, sometimes called drift. They should be talking about pretty similar things. But if you look at the maps and you look at the legends, excuse me, it's not very clear, but if you look at this legend there, it's like speaking a slightly different language, you know. I suggest it's a bit like me. I can understand one Indian language, but I can't speak it. Do you know what I mean? It's not quite there. And I wonder, the reason I thought I'd focus on this is because when we source information, it very much depends upon where you come from. If you think about me and Lucy, if you asked us the same question, I bet you Lucy would go onto the BGS website, okay, and she would look things up there first. I wouldn't even think about it. I would immediately go to that fantastic Scottish Soils database and website, and I would, you know, that's where I get my soils information from. So it's just quite, why does it matter? I think it matters because, and I'm going to show my age a bit here, okay? Hands up, I'm over 40, and when I did my time as an undergraduate, one of the things was, what's the difference between studying geology and soils? Because having done a little bit of geology, it was always the soft kind of scummy stuff on the surface. You know, it wasn't proper rocks and things. The key difference we always had drummed into us, one thing: soils is about the intimate mixture of, you know, and that poster says it all, of mineral and organic matter. Whereas geology is geology, it's mineral. You know? But what I'm actually saying here is that's not quite right, because more and more, if you go right back to 1970s, there was a book by a guy, and I'm getting into the realms of, that's why I said this is a very personal view, of Ken Smith. He said, actually, the first kind of way life came about was because clay minerals are capable of self-replicating in water. All right, so that's before we had RNA, DNA, bacteria, and all of that lot. So actually, that division between mineral and organic isn't quite as straightforward as you might think. So I just thought, okay, so that's not a clear-cut difference. Is it an arbitrary one? Is it just a line? Because in reality, when I go out in the field, I don't do that much anymore, but when I did go out in the soil, I'm not supposed to move. I'm too used to. When I go out in the field, I just look at this bit here, okay, the scummy stuff on the surface, and that's where you hit parent material. I've just done a little schematic. Some people would say it's the unconsolidated stuff. But basically, this break is an artificial one. But it's one that's actually very meaningful in terms of language, those maps that we saw. It all comes down to this particular kind of education system that says this is geology and this is soil. And basically the two don't really mix. Now, I find it quite interesting when I'm in a room full of, and I have in my working life been in a group of earth scientists, geologists, various flavours, and usually before they had a soils person, it would be, I don't know, called drift, overburden, superficial deposits, sediments, regolith, quitter. You know, there's all these different terms for very, very similar things, and I find it quite illuminating sometimes to find out what it's called, because that can tell you a lot about where someone's head is at in terms of looking at Earth's surface. So when I was young, this was the definition that I worked with, okay? And the key thing here is the supporting plant growth, okay? So it's that, not only is it because it's a mixture of mineral and organic, because you can have, you know, bacteria living in fissures, you know, X kilometers down, but the key difference that makes soil different from regolith, drift, overburden, whatever you want to call it, is that you can actually grow a crop in it. It's as basic as that. That's how I, you know, cut it, and I think it's a good way of simplifying it. Back to the problems when it comes to why does this matter? All different disciplines have got their own languages, and that's just the way that it goes. When you're trying to bring data together, which the Scottish Government tries to do occasionally, particularly environment data, this is where some of the differences really come alive. Now, in Scotland, you've got this Soils Archive, a national one, held at the Macaulay James Hutton Institute. Okay, it's got all these lovely kind of samples, it's got all the map, the archive, and blah, blah, blah. All paid for by whichever administration, whatever it was called at the time, but for the past plus years. Okay, so there's a real history there of survey and all of that. There's also a National Geological Repository at Kingworth, and that's funded obviously separately through NERC. Similar approach, it's an archive, it's got collections, it's got its own mapping, blah, blah, blah. When you want to pull data together, okay, for Scotland, you would think maybe you could quite easily pull national data from whichever source. If you're measuring the same thing, it's actually completely impossible to do. So it's, believe me, it's very, very hard to try and bring in soils data from what was derived from soil survey and what's derived from geological survey. And where this really is illuminated is when it comes to looking at things like peat and organic soils, which obviously for Scotland, pretty important. Okay, right, this slide here is just about me pondering on the biology side of things, because I think more and more it hasn't been a separate compartment for geology. I think more and more it's very much part of it, and not just from the fossil side but living side. So let's get back to peat. Scottish peatlands, really important, stock of carbon, also as a habitat at a UK and a global scale, estimated 1,600 million tonnes of carbon. Okay, if you multiply that by 11, that gives you the CO2 equivalents, which is, I don't know how many magnitude, but it's much, much more than any annual total emissions. Okay, so we're talking huge potential stock. Okay, and this is the stock that's not in the geology, as in, you know, in a coal or an oil or whatever reservoir. This is held in what you would call the organic kind of regolith drift in the soil. So the policy interest has really increased, because as government policy tries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promotes the use of renewables, surprise, surprise, that happens to be on peatlands in Scotland. Yeah, when we think about onshore wind farms, there's a high statistical correlation there with where you find peat. And that's where the policy interest comes in to say, right, well, who's got the information on this? I want to know what the state of Scottish peatlands are. And you have to say, well, Minister, there's some data which is held here, some here, and it's not just, you know, there's some held by the Forestry Commission, by SEPA, by lots of different statutory bodies. And that's when it comes to light, when you have to try and amalgamate it, that it's almost impossible. I suppose it's a boundary between these disciplines, and particularly on the geology side. And I've lost one of my slides I want to show you, which was the map. You just have to bear with me, okay. Now this, for example, I'm not going to bore you with classification. If I found it quite interesting to look at the definition of peat on this BGS website, and I think it was something called fossil, or something like fossil plant material, or a floral residue, or I can't remember, but you compare that to the classification of peat in, let's see if I can bring it up for you. Sorry about this. Find where I've put it. If you look at the major soil subgroup, one of the big divisions in soils is organic. It's a little bit different to the classification there. You've got 12 different major soil groups within that peat. Okay, so it just gives you a little bit of an idea about the different places people are coming from and what that means in terms of data at the end of the day. Yeah, because that's kind of like the crux of it, is if you're trying to gather this, it makes it incredibly hard. And it's actually something that the Scottish Government tried to do in their SEWeb, if anyone's heard of SEWeb. You're very unfortunate in some ways if you have, because it was, believe me, this is a website that SEPA are charged with bringing data from lots of different sources together and badging it under land, air, water, the different media. And my God, that that shows you instantly where some of the biggest issues are. Yeah. So if you look at that website, there was a lot of arguments at the time about where do you put things, where do you put soils, where do you put peat. Actually, it ended up being 2 separate boxes. If you go on to the front page of that, it shows you a bit better on here. There's rocks and landforms and there's soils. Yeah, so they're not even in the same, block really. Yeah, which is, I don't know, makes it a little bit strange. But anyway, that is a very recent thing. Yeah, it was only last year that it started up. Another example, there's a soils website and database that has data from SNH, SEPA, Forestry Commission. Unfortunately, on the steering group, one of the major sources of information, no BGS. I find, that tells you something. Yeah, that's quite a big hole, isn't it? Forgive the pun, but so there's this example here of the separation of disciplines when it comes to looking at bringing data together. When in the consultancy world, as Lucy and myself have a bit to do with, what you find is, and I found this quite interesting as well, is there's like 2 different camps, as it were. If you're a developer looking for some consultancy advice, it's split into kind of the geotechnical side, where you're looking at stability, shear strength, things like that. That's kind of like almost the engineering side. And there's another set of consultants that you'll bring in to look at the more fluffy kind of peat depths and habitats and all of that. And what surprises me is that you end up with surveys done, reports written on essentially the same thing, but completely that I can't read across, yeah, because they are, they use a different terminology, they're looking at completely different things, and yet they've been onto the same site, sometimes used very, very similar equipment, but they've come back with, chalk and cheese. So it's quite, not that we would want to suggest ways of saving money for people, but, it demonstrates to you that you can look at the same thing here, which is peat, and come back with some very, very different data. You're looking at very different aspects of it. Another example is quite hopefully interesting too, is part of the Scottish Government's drive for trying to get data on, say, peatlands in Scotland, what are their conditions. they commissioned a little bit of work on new methods. So instead of sending out some poor buggers to go and, survey this, which is not easy, we looked at perhaps remote sensing, LiDAR, ground penetrate. There's some new novel methods out there. And believe it or not, there's a lot of work done by BGS on LiDAR and GPR. There's a lot of work done separately, on the soil side, using exactly the same technique, but you can't bring it together, And again, that was one of the main kind of conclusions, trying to look at new ways of monitoring and providing information, is that this historical kind of division is still very much with us, If I commission something to look at whether GPR and LiDAR could provide an alternative for monitoring peatland condition, someone will probably go, do you know BGS did a great, and you think, well, they probably did, but it's not likely to come into the realms of, for example, peatland restoration, soils policy, because it sits somewhere else. And that's a function of many things, but what I'm saying here is some of that comes down to that division in the subject, and also obviously funding. It's held by NERC. It's a bit different to if it's held at Scottish Gov, or a main research provider. But I found that quite interesting. Okay. So I've just said there's policy interest in there. Policy interest usually means there's quite a bit of funding going into it as well. And it's trying to provide the data and the advice for the policymakers in a way that actually makes use of what's already there, that makes use of so many years of surveying, and the expertise that's out there. I don't know how you get there, but I would suggest if I was, I don't know what the buzzword is these days, citizen science or something like that, I'd be going, how much did we pay, as taxpayers? And believe me, I've had to do this for soils, and it's quite, if you count up taxpayers' money over X many years, it's an enormous amount of resource, and I would not, as a geologist or as a soil scientist, but as a taxpayer, say, my God, this is shocking. You know what I mean? Someone's been paying for similar work through this avenue and someone else through a different avenue, and at the end of the day, after all that effort, all that resource, we can't even pull it together. So I suppose what I'm suggesting here is that there is a real wide open space there to try and pull together some of these huge important data sources, and some of that has to do with the way, the language that we use and the communication, and I think that's where it comes down to, although I was being a bit flippant there, about how we refer to drift or, all of that. And the other, I'm sure there's lots of ways that non-geologists refer to things that are not right either. But I'm saying that that is symptomatic of actually something that's quite important. I found it, if I find it hard to read across, then it's going to be difficult for anybody to try and make sense of the data that we have there on the same resource, which is, in this case, peat. And how you consider that, where you put it, really depends upon what you're going to report on. Yeah? If you're just thinking about the geotechnical side, or you're thinking about how much overburden there is, you've got a very, very different perspective to someone who's actually interested in the stratigraphy of the peat resource itself and its functions. Do you know what I mean? So it's very, very illuminating, but the practicalities are that as there's a more kind of need really for information and data on peat, I think it's going to have to be done somehow or other. Yeah, because there isn't the resource to say, let's create something new. You have to deal with what you have. And from a policy point of view, I would say wherever there is an initiative like a SEWeb or a Scottish Soils database on my list, I would ensure that I had BGS on there. Okay, but that's just, like I said, my own personal view. You know, it's just from where I've come from in the Scottish Government. So that's really what I wanted to harp on about. Yeah, I can show you some nice, really boring slides about classification and distribution of peat and all the work that James Hutton have done on, you know, where it is, compare it to. But I think that's the key message there, is that it's a shame at the end of the day that we shouldn't really be in different universes. Thank you very much.
Hello, this is Lucy speaking. Do you have any questions, first of all, in the room for Geeta? Yes, do you want to just say it to me and I'll regurgitate it for this microphone, or you can.
I really want to say the kind of this gap and the communication gap that Geeta's highlighted. It reminds me a little bit of the same issue that you get into the geotechnical end of geology, between when you're trying to translate geological information into engineering information. And there's quite a lot of work being going on to try and cross that communications gap. I was wondering if you've got any suggestions as to how we might start bridging this divide between geology and this soft stuff that hard rock geologists tend to be very dismissive of, and the soil scientists who obviously are very interested in its development and lots of other stuff about it. How you start, the cross communication there.
I would probably say, if I was commissioning some work, I would report the issue, and I would say, I'd lock the door and say, you know what, you come up after 2 hours, and put BGS and the soil community, and you say, give me one map, give me a language that everyone can communicate with. I want to know about this resource. Tell me about it. Your organisations, your particular subject areas, have that. Communicate. You know, so you have to actually force it at the institutional level. Because if there isn't the requirement to do so, like with anything, there's why should anybody bother? So I think it has to come from, there has to be a need for it, a requirement for it, and actually forcing the issue to say, you know what, empty out those archives, dust down those maps, because, whoever is asking it, but I suggest it will be central government, say, we want this data and we want it amalgamated and converted, and we want it done by such and such a time, and you lot, surely to God, can come out with something sensible and not allow things to be in different boxes. But that's my perspective anyway. But should that go down like a lead balloon? But I think that's probably one of the only way.
Yes, Richard Holmes. When I've worked offshore as a marine geologist, and I've done some work for strategic environmental assessment for the trading industry. One thing we have to take into account was the hydrodynamics of the seabed and the seabed. I suspect I've got to do the same with climate. We haven't mentioned that yet. Or weather in the soil survey.
Oh yeah, I mean there's a lot of, do you mean trying to predict or simulate what happens with climate change?
Well, not with climate change, where the climate changes across the country from east to west, north to south, how wet it is and so on. We have to take, not directly in parallel, but we take strength near seabed currents and they tie in extremely well with the seabed sediments. And that ties in extremely well with the seabed benthos, bottom living creatures. So we have done this offshore. Anecdotally, I'd say when I was doing my undergraduate stuff many years ago, like myself, I found peat absolutely fascinating. It was totally unknown. And I was actually more interested in hard rock geology I was doing. I support you. Support your call for integration. But I think the main question is, I presume you do take into account climate into your
Absolutely, yeah.
very good.
That was the early days of soil surveying, you know, when they had to do agricultural land classification, when crop production was the be all and end all. Obviously climate and, you know, there was a lot of different factors of which climate, topography or one, that you used to grade land to give it its class 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, it's there, it's been done, and fortunately sits in a particular silo. But it is all there, and they do all the climate change scenarios as well as say how, you know, the classification of land is going to change. But what I'm saying is it doesn't, kind of come across. It should do.
Well, we were forced to write in that simple language the layman could understand. That was a regulation. If we brought in any terminologies, which wouldn't be useful to another person, it was scoured out and edited, and the contract got thrown back at them.
I think it's very, it's a hard task. But there are instances where you have to stick to your guns, as it were, because when it comes to providing guidance, publishing guidance, you have to adopt one or the other. Okay, so I'll give you an example, writing guidance for site surveys. The decision made was we would go with the Soil Survey of Scotland in defining what peat is going on. Depends on where you are, which part of the UK, which system you go with. I mean, so it gets to that kind of level where you say, right, when we talk about peat, we're talking about the Soil Survey of Scotland definition of peat, which means it has to be 50 centimetres or more depth. So there's sometimes where you can't use generic, terms. You have to.
No, but there is a case which we always made, which we always did, is to put in huge appendices to find exactly what we meant.
Yeah.
So it's about perhaps 1/5 of the importance appendix definitions. And the geotechnical.
Yeah. Accumulating. Those stuff.
I've got another question, if that's allowed.
Yeah, I've got another question. I'm just going to ask if you can speak up quite
okay.
loud so the people on the line can hear as well, because they're very interested in the discussion.
From British Geological Survey, ex-BGS, I would say, how have you found that the samples that we stored, have they been useful to you in the national core stores? Certainly offshore, we took all the samples and preserved them very carefully. Maybe not so not so easy, not so comprehensive on land, I'm not too sure.
To be honest with you, the only archives samples that I've ever dealt with or come across have been at the Soil Survey archives, whether that's England, Wales or Scotland. I've never had the pleasure of looking at the National Geological kind of equivalent, the BGS archive.
Right.
So
There's a huge resource there for you. You might not even have to send people out. I don't know how peat deteriorates with time.
yeah, that's, like I said, that's a symptom in some ways that I've never put my toe through that door at Keyworth to have a look. So.
Might be surprised, yeah.
I'm sure I will.
Any more questions in the room? I'm just going to double check any questions online. There's no messages come up with regards to questions. Has anyone got anything online? Last check. Okay. Well, needless to say, we want to thank. Oh. Nope. Thanks, Tom. There's a little bit of a delay, but we've got your message there. And hopefully you managed to hear the end of that discussion. Apologies if you couldn't quite hear it. We're getting used to doing these webinars, and the more we do them, the more we're learning about what you can and can't hear. So basically, I just want to say thank you very much for Geeta for taking the time to do this presentation and to start a little bit of a discussion amongst us geologists and between the soil scientists, hopefully. So thank you very much, Geeta. Shall we give a round of applause? And if anyone's got an avatar online, you can be clapping too. Thanks very much for attending online as well.